All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Lesson 8, talking about the United States Constitution. If you have been following your way through the lesson, you've already watched the Schoolhouse Rock version of the Constitution, and I promise I will not sing to you. That would be cruel and unusual punishment, which is actually in the Constitution, and it's illegal, so we won't do that. What we do want to do is go a little deeper in talking about how the Constitution was drafted, what the writers of the Constitution had to work their way through in terms of compromising, and what provisions and protections the Constitution affords all of us as American citizens. So this is perhaps one of the most critical documents ever in the history of mankind, humankind, that's been drafted on the political rights, and it came out of good old United States of America. So let's take a look and see what it talks about. Well, the first thing before we talk about the Constitution itself, let's talk about who was in the United States at the time of the writing of the Constitution. If you recall, the Revolutionary War is ending or just about to end, and we have all these people that now are going to have to govern themselves. Britain has been governing them up to this point. They're going to have to figure out how to govern themselves, and to do that, they're going to have a rule book, and that essentially is what the Constitution will ultimately do. So the players at the time are, we have up in New England, we have merchants who have a commercial interest. They're bankers and lawyers and people of that sort. We have southern planters, and they're dependent on slavery, which not the rest of the United States does not really care for. We have the royalists, who are commissioned to protect the crown. That's the folks that are trying to help the colony or collect taxes from for the British. We have shopkeepers, artisans, laborers, and we have small farmers. That's who makes up the United States. And all of these people have different needs and different desires. All of that is going to have to be dealt with in this new Constitution. So the first effort at some sort of a way to govern the United States is called the Articles of Confederation. And it governed the U.S. from 1781 up until 1787. Not a very long time, only 6 years. And the reason is it didn't work very well. It was the first written document governing the United States, and it limited the powers of the central government. So the federal government, or the United States government, was limited. Most of the power was at the state level. There was no independent judiciary, that's a court system, and there was no executive branch. It was just all equal states, and the states were the ones that had the sovereignty. They're the ones that got to make the most decisions. We think of that as very odd today because the federal government is the most powerful, but back then the states were the most powerful. They executed the laws. Each state had one vote in Congress, but the congressional representatives were chosen by the state legislature. It essentially was not a very powerful government. It didn't work very well in terms of pulling all these very different states together. So what were some of the problems with the Articles of Confederation? Well, there was no executive or no president, so there was no one person to kind of run the country. There was no court system at the federal level, and there was limited protection from federal, foreign, and domestic threats. So the British up in Canada, the Spanish down in Florida, any domestic unrest that might happen, or the Native American issues could not be dealt with. There was no standing army and things of that sort. There was no ability to raise revenue. There was no taxes, in other words, and there was no ability to regulate commerce. So every state could kind of decide to work with whatever country they wanted to in terms of commerce. And one particular event really showed how bad the Articles of Confederation were in terms of keeping the peace and keeping the country together. And it was called Shays' Rebellion. And it took place in 1786, and there was this farmer named Daniel Shays who led a mob in Massachusetts. And what he was trying to do is prevent the bank from foreclosing on the farms, kind of similar to what we're dealing with right today. But what happened when he led this mob through Massachusetts is it showed the vulnerability of the state government and the inability of the federal government to try to help maintain order. So whereas today the U.S. National Guard, or the National Guard would come out, or the U.S. Army would come out, there was no such thing as that back then. And so it showed that these were real problems. And essentially it prompted Congress to call for representatives to be sent back to Philadelphia to discuss another constitutional revision, to modify that. The Constitutional Congress was back in session. So in 1787, in May, we had a constitutional convention. 55 delegates were represented. 12 states were part of this. The only exception was Rhode Island. And it was made up of the elites of the country. The wealthy folks, the well-educated folks attended. The mass of humanity did not. And these elites were kind of reluctant to grant power to the masses. They didn't think it was a good idea to give the vote to everybody. Only the wealthy and the educated, they thought at first, should have the right to vote and make decisions about the government. What were some of the competing interests? Well, we talked a little bit about those groups, but let's take a look at them. We had some property interests that were competing. Slavery at the time was considered property. The slave was not a human being; they were property. We had philosophical and ethical principles that were different between these groups. We had the question about representation. How would these large states, like at the time Virginia, be represented in comparison to small states, like, for example, at the time, Delaware? And we also had some economic interests. So all of those things were competing, and we had to figure out a way to make sure that everybody was happy in order to modify the Articles of Confederation into something better. The real sticking point which came to light was the issue of representation. We had two major plans that were put forth. One was called the Virginia Plan, and that said that representation should be based on the population in each state. So the larger the population you had, the more representatives you had in the federal government, in whatever that might be, a Congress per se. And so states with large populations loved that because they would have more people, they would have more power, and they would be able to get through what they wanted to. The New Jersey plan, however, was also proposed, and New Jersey at that time being a small state in terms of population, said, oh no, every state should be equally represented regardless of the population. So whether today you're Alaska or California, you just have two people representing you. And that, of course, appealed to the small states. So we have an impasse here. These two plans were thrown out, and we can't figure out what to do until we have something called the Great Compromise. And this is put forth by the delegates from Connecticut, Connecticut being kind of in the middle in terms of population at the time. And what they said is, let's bring both of those systems together, and let's create what's called a bicameral legislature. Bicameral, bi meaning two, cameral meaning houses, two houses legislature. So a House and a Senate, which is what we have today. The first Chamber of Commerce would be built based on the number of inhabitants in each state. That was called the House. It still is. So, for example, California today has 52 delegates, representatives in the House, and Alaska has 1 because the populations are so different. The second chamber, however, would be based on equal representation, and that's the Senate. And so here's the example for that. California has 2 senators, Alaska has 2 senators, even though their populations are radically different. So that was the Great Compromise that was put through to try to figure out a way to make everybody happy with the new Constitution. Another thing we had to deal with was slavery, and the delegates at the Constitutional Convention really kind of dropped back and punted on this. They didn't want to deal with it. They were nervous about it. They knew that the southern states would all leave if we tried to abolish slavery, and so they essentially put it off for several years until the Civil War. And so we had some real issues about, were slaves property or citizens? One of the things that the slave states wanted is they wanted not only to have slaves as property, but they also wanted to consider them in terms of their voting. If voting was based on population, they wanted those slaves certainly not to be able to have the right to vote, but to be counted in terms of how many representatives they would have in the federal government. So the compromise came up to be 3/5. So every slave was counted as 3/5 of a human being for purposes of apportioning out representation. So if you had 5 slaves, they would count as 3 people when you were figuring out the population of a particular state. And that allowed for the southern states to feel like they had better representation. It's an ugly thing to think about, apportioning up parts of people. You have to keep in mind that back at this time there was very little concern about the welfare of African Americans, and unfortunately that went on far too long and wasn't really dealt with until the Civil War. So what is another thing that the Constitution does? Well, it does something called checks and balances. It tries to make sure that the power is apportioned evenly. So the state has power, as does the national government. The House has power in the Congress, and so does the Senate. The executive, the presidential branch, has power, and so does the legislature. The courts have power, and so in terms of what they can do, and so does the executive branch and the legislative branch. So all these checks and balances so that no one part of the government would be powerful enough to take over. That's what they did because they were so concerned about a king or one person being real powerful, as they'd just gotten rid of in losing British rule. Then another thing, the last thing that they needed before they could actually draft the Constitution and vote on it was amendments. They wrote the Constitution out. It listed out how the the government would run, and then they had to come up with essentially some rights for the people. Before the states would sign it, they wanted to guarantee that their people would have certain rights. And so that came to be known as the amendments. The first 10 of those amendments were known as the Bill of Rights, and still are. And they provide basic fundamental rights and protections. Another thing that the writers did that's incredibly amazing is that they looked at this document as a fluid document, as something that was going to change over time. They recognized they couldn't anticipate all the things that would happen over time, and they wanted a system to be able to change it. And that's really what amendments are. It's a two-step process. You have to have a proposal by either 2/3 of the Congress or a state house, and then you have to have ratification by 3/4 of all the states. And that would lead to an amendment of the Constitution.